Coming up on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show.
I tend to look at the security industry, security practitioners as, sort of cowboys. And of course, everybody loves the idea of hackers. And you could probably hire 5 different pen testing firms, and maybe you'll get compromised by all of them, but probably 5 different ways. Whereas a full disclosure white box approach, we put it all out on the table, and it's also fantastic for identifying flaws at the design level that could otherwise cost a lot more money later on when a pen tester identifies it.
We speak about our offensive game so much that we forget that we need a good defense in business too. That is effectively protecting the value that we create. However, and I speak from experience, the shiny new things seem so much more important than the seemingly dull security and privacy. Well, when looked at from a risk perspective, security and privacy all of a sudden become the purview of the manager. In this episode of the IoT Business Show, I speak with Paul Dant about IoT risk assessment, as well as security by design, threat modeling, and other important topics to the manager.
All this and more on this episode of the IoT Inc. Business Show. The people, the business, and the technology of the next generation internet. This is the IoT Inc. Business Show. And now, here's your host, Bruce Sinclair.
Hello and welcome to the IoT Inc. Business Show. This show is made possible by sales of my book, IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, and the IoT Inc. Certified IoT Professional, or ICIP, online training and certification program. Become a certified IoT professional by completing the program's 3 courses: ICIP Technology, ICIP Business, and ICIP Strategy and Digital Transformation. Details of which can be found at www.iot-inc.com. That's www.iot-inc.com.
With me today on episode 32 is Paul Dant. Paul is currently Chief Strategist and Managing Principal at Independent Security Evaluators and has over 20 years of experience in security research and consulting. In practice, he specializes in building pragmatic security solutions, guiding some of the largest enterprises in the world to build effective security programs. I met Paul at the IoT Security Conference in Boston, where he was presenting and I was doing a workshop. I was so impressed by his depth of knowledge, I wanted to dig in a little bit further. Paul, welcome.
Thanks so much, Bruce.
Hey, thanks for agreeing to do this interview at such a last minute. My scheduled guest literally canceled on me the day of the recording, so I appreciate you taking the time out of your day.
It's my pleasure.
So where are you right now, just so our listeners can get a little bit of the environment that you're within?
Sure. I'm actually sitting in a hotel lobby in Portland, Oregon. I'm on sort of a 2 to 3 day speaking engagement tour.
Ah, okay. Now, does that include Boston, or is this in addition to Boston?
This is in addition to Boston. This is a whole new set of talks.
All right. So what type of talks are you doing?
Primarily, we do some work at ISE with the hospitality industry, and I'm actually here for a conference with the Hotel Technology Next Generation Group. They look at next generation technology being deployed in hotels, which obviously ties very well into IoT. And so I'm here speaking about secure product design.
Oh, very cool. And is that the same presentation you're giving at the different conferences also, or you have different topics?
Pretty different topics. I tend to speak pretty extemporaneously, so you never really know where my talks are going to go.
Yeah, I like that. I did catch your presentation. I liked I think one of your first slides was you as, I don't know, how old were you in that picture? Maybe 10 years old or something like that? 12?
9 or 10. Mm-hmm.
9 or 10, huh? And describe that picture for our listeners.
Sure. So it's a picture of me sitting in front of my first computer, a Tandy 1000. I think I was smiling widely because I had just upgraded to 640 kilobytes of RAM.
Yeah. And there was some other stuff there was some other things in the background too, weren't there? I thought that I saw some like products, or maybe your dad was there, or what was it?
Yeah, I had a snapshot of a floppy disk with the game
That's it.
Oliver's Travels, which is
Oh, that's right. That's right.
the first product I ever brought to market in the fourth grade.
Jeez. You're ahead of your time, man.
I was, and what's interesting about that, I actually mentioned this in my talk on secure design yesterday.
Mm,
That was actually my first lesson learned in secure product design is never trust that your secrets are safe. And
okay.
it was the shareware model back then. And so, of
Yeah.
course, there was a key required to play the game. I charged $5 a license and
Jeez.
never expected anyone to actually look at the code and see the key right there out in the open. And there went my revenue stream.
Oh well, yeah, no, and I remember. Then you got into you. I think. Well, we'll get into it. We'll get it.
Sure.
Why don't we start by you telling us a little bit about yourself and specifically your background in IoT?
Absolutely. So, as you mentioned, I've been professionally in the security industry in the security space for about
Mm,
20 years. I work today with independent security evaluators, and we're basically a white box oriented system security assessment firm. So we specialize in looking at the security of individual components that make up overall systems. We
okay.
found ourselves really looking at supply chain as overall systems, which is what has really led us into looking at IoT security specifically. A lot of the supply chains and production life cycles of our clients feature these types of devices, and as I'm
Hmm.
sure we'll be talking about today, that extends our security concerns into areas not necessarily centralized on that single product.
Hmm. Hmm. Now, have you seen? What do you consider the biggest differences between what you've been seeing in IoT and what you've been seeing in other places? For example, I know that you work in the digital media space, and I did not know until now the hotel space is kind of an area too. So, what do you see? What do you see as being the same or different between IoT and the other areas that you're involved in?
So I think some of the differences primarily center around overall awareness of
Mm,
the risks involved in using technology. I think because so much of IoT is driven toward the consumer market,
yes.
devices on the body and
Mm,
essentially
mm,
devices that follow us through our lives. Um, I see more of an assumed security and privacy that's an inherent in that product on the
mm,
part of consumers. They
mm.
expect it and they assume it.
Right.
And the similarity with IoT security that I'm seeing across all of our industries is that not only do we see the same types of security flaws in
Mm,
all of these
mm.
industries, but they're also the same types of security problems that we've really been battling for a couple of decades now.
Right, right. No, I remember you mentioning that in your presentation, and you were saying you can't believe it. But what are some of the same things that you're seeing? Not to dig into it too much right now, but what are some of the same things you're seeing from 20 years ago?
So I think there's a whole set of what I would consider to be design flaws, and in many cases that just really comes down to not considering security at
Mm,
design time, and
right.
that's something that has been a pervasive challenge for us. As long as we've had this notion of systems, um, I think something else that's certainly worth mentioning is web security, and we can get into a little bit more detail on this later. But I
Mm,
see a
mm.
lot of web security flaws that surprised me today, given how much uh, capability is out there at the framework level when you're building these
Right,
applications to properly secure them.
right, right. It almost seems like people are going out of their way to turn off the capability of these security frameworks just to, I don't know why. Why do you think?
Uh, I- you know, sometimes I look at these flaws and I almost think that maybe it's done intentionally, even though I know it's not. But it's surprising that sometimes it is that hard to
Right.
bypass security in these frameworks. So I think a lot of times it really comes down to just, again, a lack of awareness when you're
Yeah.
talking about being a software developer or a product development manager.
Mm,
Typically, the focus is on functionality and quickness to
that's right.
market. And
That's
so,
right.
there's a pressure that those individuals are under to perform at a level that's bringing the right amount of security despite their lack of understanding of how to do that. So I think that's really what drives a lot of this, where, this could be a quick way to do something really cool in our product. It does require me to turn this capability called request validation off. Not really sure what that does, but
right.
and then we
What the
find out
heck?
later that that's one layer protecting you against things like cross-site scripting.
Right. Which has been around forever.
Absolutely.
Yeah. No, we'll get into that, but I think what you're saying is, a big part of this is education, right?
It's a really big part of it. Education, and I like to differentiate education and awareness. And I think the awareness piece is lacking at the top level, at the leadership level in organizations in so many cases. And that's what ultimately, when we don't have the security mindset permeating down from the top leadership layer, you can't really expect security awareness in that organization.
Yeah. Well, we're here to help. So before we get into that, I know a little bit about you now, but what's another interesting fact that maybe most people don't know?
Let's see. I do talk about this when I introduce myself during my talks, but it's always a funny story. So I have a lot of stories about various times that I was caught breaking into things.
Okay.
I think
that's the black hat side of things.
The black hat side of things, and this is when I was much younger. So obviously, I'm not incriminating myself here. But a lot of it had to do with school systems. And the way I actually got my first job really looking at security came about because I figured out a way to jump into the modem bank. Obviously this is before we had anything other than dial-up. But the modem bank of my school system, and I was able to call all of these BBSs in California that I had heard of that my parents wouldn't let me call because it was long distance. I got caught. And, as a result, they looked at it and ended up agreeing to not contact law enforcement
which is a good thing.
Exactly. If I agreed to help them ensure that no one else was able to do that. So I like that. That's really how I got my start in thinking like the bad guy.
Yeah. A career was born, huh? Well, let's then talk about security and IoT. What do you, in your perspective, from your perspective, Paul, where are we? What's the overall state of security and IoT today?
Right. So we were talking before about, so much of IoT being driven to the consumer market. And I think what that says about security is that overall the awareness of security and privacy concerns is lower, but the risks around those security and privacy concerns are actually much higher in this industry.
Interesting.
And that's not a great combination. When we look at enterprise security, even when we're talking about enterprise security dealing with IoT devices in the workplace, while we do find that a lot of organizations are still struggling to do security right, if you will, they're at least aware of the risks and in varying degrees trying to do something about it. So when you look at, that contrasted with consumers who just not only aren't necessarily aware, but again, they're in many cases making an assumption about the security and privacy involved in using these devices. And that's very dangerous. So I think, what is really driving this, and I mentioned this before as well, the focus on quickness to market and those types of things. When you're propositioned with developing a product and bringing it to market, I think a lot of the vendors and manufacturers, they understand that security is important and they want to protect their users, the consumers' security and privacy. Sometimes they even think that they are. But as we're seeing across all industries involved in IT, there's such a lack of security expertise. There's just not enough to go around. When you couple that with the fact that not every software developer or anything like that is necessarily a security expert, it becomes a real challenge.
Yeah, it does. And, speaking as a former product manager, specifically if you have a strong product manager and they don't, see the same value of security. And hey, I was guilty of this too. When you're fighting these product wars, it's a feature by feature weaponry. And, until security, what, I don't, what's going to happen? What's going to make security hit the top of the list rather than the bottom list? Is it going to have to be something catastrophic that's going to happen? Is it going to be government involvement? Is it going to be, consumers revolt?
It's a great question, and it's a big part of what ISE is trying to find a solution for in a lot of our research specific to IoT. So I happened to have a chance this summer at DEF CON to sit down with a really interesting guy. He is basically responsible for innovation for a very well-known company that manufactures a lot of things, actually, but one in particular are faucets and toilets and those types of things that we use in a home. And obviously, IoT and just overall internet connectivity is seeping into that market. I want to be able to, for whatever reason, control the mix of hot and cold water in this specific faucet from my iPhone or my Android device.
Sure.
And just a quick tangent, I'll mention something else about the IoT risks, especially as it pertains to consumers. We as consumers tend to choose convenience over security and privacy, really every time. And so when you mix those things together, now I want that convenience of being able to manipulate hot and cold water balance remotely. The manufacturer looks at it and they see the risks in many cases, and they see where this could go, and they know that they need to secure it. But for them, what it comes down to is it goes all the way down to even a per unit cost for manufacturing. And if that control that is necessary for security is going to be 75 cents additionally per unit to manufacture the product, it will be met with a lot of scrutiny and very difficult to justify. At the same time, we can't suddenly expect the manufacturers to take those costs and spike their products' prices to consumers and send the message that, well, you need to pay for security, because again, as consumers, we tend to already expect and assume that it's there.
Yeah, and like you said, we prefer convenience over security, it seems, as well. So it's like, okay, you need to pay more for something you don't really want, okay?
That's exactly right.
Yeah. So what do you think is gonna change this?
Well, there's the doomsday scenario, and then there's the light at the end of the tunnel scenario. So I think
okay, tell me about the light at the end of the tunnel.
Yeah, so let's talk about that one. I think a lot of the responsibility comes down to vendors of these IoT devices, especially consumer devices, making it a priority to educate themselves on the security and the privacy risks that are involved in using their technology. But then also taking that extra step to then, in very marketable ways, if you will, convey that information to the consumers that are buying their products. We see warning labels on cigarette cartons. We see warning labels on alcohol bottles. I believe that something analogous in a way to that is very much in line with some of the IoT devices that we can just freely purchase and consume on the market.
Yeah, no, I like the end of the light at the end of the tunnel model. In fact, the previous podcast was more on privacy, and Dale Smith, who's chief compliance officer at a startup that's providing this product that effectively does that. It tries to simplify it boils down, the lawyer 12-page agreement down to maybe some icons and some very simple sentences, so that there's at least that understanding, and it seems like that would go a long way, right?
I think it would, and it could also have the side effect, the secondary effect. At least I would hope, when consumers start to see warning labels, and I know that's a bit extreme and probably not the right approach, but we'll just simplify it and say these warning labels that consumers would see with these products might, be catalyst for further thinking on the issue, and maybe we would see consumers start to become more interested in just educating themselves about security and privacy overall. I've said for a very long time, even going back to when I was a kid in that picture in front of my Tandy 2000. I watched the internet grow up in many ways. And I think that in my observation, the technology, the connectivity, the speed in which we can transmit data, the massive amounts of data that we can store in a single location now, it's evolved way too fast for our understanding in terms of the ramifications. And so it's very difficult for us to use this technology responsibly because it's just evolved way too fast for us to really process it as consumers.
Yeah, no, I agree. And if it's evolved way too fast for us, you can imagine, how it's evolved for regulators and the law. But, going back, so to put this more concretely, the listeners of this podcast are actually building those products that we're talking about. And I could see it's not necessarily a warning label, but maybe, like that label that's in your clothing that tells you can throw it in the dryer, you can iron it, you have to, hang it, just something like that. And I could see the situation where I go into, my big box electronics store and I'm comparing two products. One product has this label. It's kind of like just the privacy label that just explains what's going on and says, we're going to do this with your information. We're going to do this, and that. And then I look at the same product right beside it, and it doesn't have any of that information. Mm-hmm. I can say for myself, convenience notwithstanding, as we spoke, but for myself, if there are two products and they're pretty similar, I would definitely be wondering, and I would probably go with the one that had that information on the box. I don't know. I think I'm speaking for Joe Consumer, or I don't know. Has that been? What do you think? As I say, just from a consumer point of view.
Right. Yeah, I tend to agree. It's certainly something that would compel me to choose one over the other. I think, now for manufacturers of these products and vendors, now is the time for transparency. Because, there's just, for anyone who really works in this industry and understands security and then looks realistically at the latest breaches, and I certainly don't need to name any organizations, but they've all been in the news. There's a little side note that tends to come along with that media. And I say side note only because it's, I don't think it's intentionally left out, but it's just not a focus. But I think it's a very important aspect. And that is that most of these breaches, were identified 3, 4, 5 years after the actual initial compromise occurred. And that's very telling of a lot of things. And I think that's an important consideration that tends to get overlooked. So anyone that works in this industry, I tend to assume that most organizations are compromised. Now, there are all types of degrees of compromise, and a lot more analysis needs to be done. But it makes it both very difficult to work in this industry when you have that perspective. Fighting the good fight becomes frustrating sometimes. But at the same time, if you at least start at that point and move forward from there, well, it simplifies things a bit in terms of
it's a different perspective.
Absolutely.
Yeah. All right. Well, I think we can talk philosophical for a long time, but let's get into more tangible. And when I say tangible, I want to speak specifically about security by design. Now, I hear this term. I think intuitively I can understand what it means. But why don't you dig into this for us a little bit, Paul? What is security by design?
Sure. So I'll start first with designing without security and what that looks like, because it's a model that I think most of us are familiar with, and it's essentially designing a product with primarily the intended functionality in mind, and again that quickness to market and low cost for manufacturing. So when we don't think about security up front, and typically that's driven because without design security, you're making an assumption that, well, I'll have a firewall there and the data is going to be encrypted. So assumptions that there's security elsewhere and it doesn't need to be forefront during the design phase. I can describe this chart that I'm sure most of the listeners have seen before. It's the chart that looks at the cost of identifying and fixing flaws as you move through the system development lifecycle.
Right.
And the idea, of course, is that anything you identify at the design phase is significantly lower in cost and overall effort to fix than if you've already marketed the product and sold it. It's in production. So I think that's the justification for security by design. And what we really mean by that is simply consider security from the design phase forward. A lot of people talk about the need to gather security requirements, but it's so often overlooked. And I think there are a number of reasons for that. The lack of awareness and understanding is a big part of it. But I also think that people tend to look at it as a very tedious exercise. It can be, but it's a critical part of the overall process. So,
well, so I mean, you're I think you're highlighting one thing that's starting to resonate with me is you're saying, I mean, that makes sense in the design, security by design. That means during the design of the product, just like you're going to have other requirements, the requirements from a business point of view are going to be the information requirements, for example. What you're saying is as part of that requirement document, you need to have security requirements too, right?
That's absolutely right. And, I'll even take a step back in terms of what we do in designing security in. Before we're even looking at overall requirements, I tend to encounter assessments where we ask for documentation and specifically some type of architecture diagram. And in the industry, it's kind of just a running joke now, where we ask clients for those types of things, and they either don't exist or it's 7 years old or whatever the case might be. And the thing about that is that when we're looking at security at the design phase, for me, an architecture isn't just a document that you can provide to someone else, but it's an indication of an overall understanding of how your particular system works.
Yeah, it's a touchstone.
Right. And, when we look at system design, in particular from a security perspective, there are certain things that we're really concerned about. We're concerned about, the overall components of the system and how they talk with each other. Inputs and outputs is what it really comes down to. So if you don't have that architecture, it typically means you don't really have that understanding of your system. And that leads to all sorts of questions. What are we trying to protect? Who are we trying to protect these things from? How much do these things that we're trying to protect, what's the value to us, whether it's tangible or intangible? And this all really boils down to the overall exercise of modeling threats as an extension of developing an architecture when you're designing security.
Okay. So what the takeaway that I'm getting from this, again, for our listeners, the vast majority of our listeners are managers, are higher in the organization, and I guess they may not be the ones doing the security design, but at the architectural level, the right question to ask is, okay, show me the architecture of the system. That makes sense. And now show me the security part of that. I mean, show me how security is part of this architecture. Am I kind of ham-fisting that, or what's a better way to put it?
No, I think that's correct. When I look at just the process of developing the architecture and then specifically threat modeling, which I look at as
threat modeling.
And
okay.
I look at it as kind of a lost art form. I mean, there are a lot of people out there that are really good at it, but it's not practiced that much. But it's so essential to understanding your system and ultimately developing a plan for security.
So at a high level, you're saying do this threat modeling to make sure the architecture is sound, and then we move a little bit further in the development of it, then we get into the requirements that hopefully the architecture will be able to accommodate.
That's exactly right. Yes. And during the threat modeling portion, that's really when it's time to think out of the box, open-minded, and consider all perspectives around security. I mean, that it is truly the time to think like the attacker and understand, from an attacker's perspective, all of the ways that vulnerabilities could be identified and exploited. So in a lot of cases, I think, it's very much appropriate for top-level leadership of organizations to have some level of participation in that initial part of it. Obviously the situation dependent, of course, but especially for a lot of product companies where
Sure.
you have a succinct product line. Most of these products involve some type of a cloud-based service now, so there's always going to be a level of user, customer privacy and security that makes up your overall security requirements.
Yeah, no, by definition, the Internet of Things is going to require, some cloud. And, I think what you're saying, makes sense. I think you're right. I mean, top leadership does have the right to participate. And even if it's just asking these questions, they don't have to be experts, but just know the questions. Have you done threat modeling? Okay, now let's dig in. What does that mean? Is that, I would think from a novice point of view, someone knows not that much about security, but a little bit, is that you would just make guesses as to the different ways that you can be attacked. But I would even layer on the perspective of value if I was doing it, in the sense of first maybe even asking before that, what is the most valuable components of our system? What are the areas of our system that we need to protect? And then, at least from a priority point of view, when you start doing your threat modeling, I would suspect that you'd want to look at the threats that you'd start there. You'd look at the threats that can attack from highest priority and down to lowest priority. Would that be a logical way to approach it, or what is the more standard practice way of doing it?
That is absolutely right. So at that point, you're essentially enumerating your assets.
Right.
Whether they're part of the system or protected by the system or accessed by the system. And yes, enumerating assets with some assessment of asset value. And what's really funny, if you take a step back and look at this across the landscape, the fact that so many organizations struggle to complete this exercise, don't typically have a solid understanding of the assets they're trying to protect. It kind of makes you wonder, where do those security product budgets come from? When we don't really know what we're protecting and how much it's worth, how do we really know how much to spend protecting those assets?
Yeah, good point. No, good point. And this show is all about defining, and everything I do is all about defining where is the incremental value that comes from an IoT product. And I can tell you all incremental value from an IoT product is derived from information, that is gathered from different sources of data. So we're getting down the information. And if someone doesn't know where their value is, or you're saying if they don't know the assets to protect, that's implying that they don't know what the value is of their system. So it seems to me this is very much aligned with at least the thinking I have. And obviously it's a business perspective, i.e. a value perspective, but that's kind of it's kind of the same thing, because if you define your value, then you are going to know the assets that you need to protect. And if you know the assets you need to protect, you're going to be able to do a little bit more efficient, threat modeling. Yeah? Or what do you think?
That's exactly right. And the way that tends to move forward, rather move upward in the organization, and there's a whole web of terminology that's somewhat interchangeable, but ultimately within the context of your threat model, you're identifying assets, you're identifying actual threats, which in many cases, threats are identified in this context as the actual actors carrying out attacks.
Okay.
You use the architecture of your system to identify those inputs and outputs that could potentially make up overall attack surfaces.
Right.
From there, you look at abuse and misuse cases, and those are your what-if scenarios. Well, what if this attacker did this and got to this and stole this?
Got it.
You've got a really great collection of information there. The next step is to then consider risk. And risk is really where you're more tying in those security concerns to overall business objectives and business goals. So your top level leadership can send the message downward that, hey, we're a hotel chain, and if there's a breach of security in our cloud system or our web application and user data is compromised in any way, we're going to have a very serious problem. So now we've identified that as a very high priority aspect. And now we understand overall risk. We can rate the asset value very high. we can look at the ways that that asset could be attacked that we've enumerated using our threat model, and we can start looking at things like impact of an attack, the likelihood of an attack scenario, and there are all these different equations that can be used both to derive quantitative levels of risk as well as just overall qualitative ideas of risk. But it all really does come together starting with considering security at the design phase.
Yeah, no, I like that. I mean, I this is becoming a lot clearer for me. Now, I think what we're talking about is risk assessment then, right? I mean, and I guess I'm scratching my head a little bit. You're saying there's some formulas or recipes or equations that you punch things into, and then you get a risk percentage, or can you maybe explain a little bit more on risk assessment? And if you can, it would be really great if you give us some sort of an example, even if it's not from the IoT.
Sure. So I think, again, risk, we look at it as more of a business principle, and it's really what your executive leadership is overall concerned about. Obviously, depending on the size of the organization, your executives might be involved in conversations about encryption of data at rest, but typically they're not going to be at those levels. They want to understand a higher level principle, which is the risk of, okay, well, I don't care how you're protecting that data. I just need to know that it's protected. So that's a very qualitative look at it. Now, some of these equations take things like, I mentioned the asset value before. NIST defines risk as just simply impact times likelihood. So
okay, I like that. Yeah.
Impact, on, let's just say, a scale of 1 to 3, that would just define the overall impact to that asset. Should security be compromised? Likelihood comes down to just as it says, the likelihood of that attack being carried out. Now, of course, you can break that down into multiple factors as well. Again, all of this is deriving from the data that we've enumerated in our threat model. Looking at the specific threats. So are we talking about nation-state attackers, or are we talking about just a stalker who is simply targeting a very specific organization or individual? That breaks down into a number of things: skill set, computational resources that are available, financial resources that are available, and all of those things build an overall picture of the likelihood of a very specific attack scenario being carried out. So it can get very complex in terms of assessing the overall risk for an organization, but it's not feasible in any way if you don't have some of those inputs like threat modeling and an overall system architecture that we talked about before.
Well, and also knowing where the value lies, and specifically what assets contain that value, right?
Exactly. Yes.
Yeah. Okay. Well, can you give us, I really like, the qualitative thing makes sense. I identify this asset as having value because that's why we're doing this IoT project, for example, or one of the reasons we're doing this IoT project. So we've identified, the high value target, so to speak. But I really like, this, even though it's a simple equation, this NIST equation of impact times likelihood, of trying to put some, trying to quantify it a little bit. And guys, this does not have to be super complicated, and the fact is, this could probably be done on a spreadsheet, just like you build financial models, you're building a risk model here. But Paul, if you could you give us maybe an example of, what would be an example of a risk assessment, model, I guess, or maybe just put this into I guess a use case that you've seen, or an example that you've seen.
Sure. So I'll give you a pretty extreme example, but I think it really speaks to what we're looking at, especially in the context of impact and likelihood. So if we identify our user data that's stored across a platform and a data center as our most valuable asset, our doors will close if this data is lost. So we know that it's housed in this data center. Maybe we have backups, that kind of stuff. But ultimately, what we're looking at is a super high priority asset. So the impact is high. We already know that. If that data is lost, we're impacted.
Yep.
But if we're talking specifically about, something that would need to be of the magnitude to wipe that data center out, we're not just talking about, a hard drive going bad. We've got all kinds of redundancy in place for that. We're talking about an act of God type event that wipes the data center out. That's extremely unlikely. If we say, let's say, an earthquake, and we're in a region that is not subject to frequent earthquakes, if you want to get, very quantitative about it, the likelihood factor is rapidly being diminished there. Of anything storm, tornado, anything of that sort that could wipe the data center out. So in that case, while you have a very high priority asset and the impact is high, your overall risk in that particular scenario is fairly low.
Right.
So that the two can balance each other out.
Right. And I mean, yeah, you're right. I mean, so that's that simple equation of just impact, which is high, but if you multiply that high number by a very low number, then the overall risk is low. Now, that's not really talking about availability, right? I mean, a data center or any co-location place can be attacked and made unavailable. But I guess that's a risk too, right? Not just a compromise of the data, but making sure that the data is available. Is that play into this as well?
Absolutely. And again, it's so difficult to make decisions around that when you don't have the proper data to be informed. So, data centers are very, very well versed in this type of thing. Any data center marketing is guaranteed to tell you the number of nines of availability that they're guaranteeing.
What they do for DDoS attacks and how they can prevent them.
Exactly. And before ensuring, especially because so many, there's financial implications for the provider if those SLAs are not met. And service level agreement. But so before any of those providers are going to publish that information, these are our SLAs, and this is how much money you get back if we fail to meet it.
Right.
They've done these types of risk assessments. They've looked at the overall technical security risks that could impact availability. That's bubbled up to meet with business objectives and overall business risks. And then finally, the executive leadership is seeing that whole risk landscape and making the decision as to what SLA can we reasonably agree to and what financial implications can we safely put in place.
Yeah, no, I like that. And that makes a lot of sense. I mean, and that makes a lot of sense for data at rest, right? So that's the asset and it's at rest. Now let's move up the chain a little bit. For IoT, you're collecting that data, you're transporting that data, and then you're resting that data somewhere. So we've talked about the resting part. Now I've heard a little bit, and maybe you have too, for example, certain platforms are providing SLAs for the platform, and the platform's job is not quite at the sensor. Some of them get into the sensor, with an agent piece of code, but generally it's at the OT/IT interface where they start at the IT interface. So it's going to be all over Internet Protocol, but they will give you an SLA saying, we will be up this percentage at a time. So I guess just, squinting your eyes a little bit, the transport of that data, an SLA, service level agreement would kind of be a very useful tool and would be something that maybe you'd want to shop for if, again, putting security by design right from the very beginning, assuming you are going to use a platform, and a lot of companies will. I would think, just moving up the chain from data at rest to data in motion, an SLA there would be useful. And do you agree with that? And is there any other points, to kind of contemplate for the data at rest, at the data in motion?
So I'll start with that. The first piece. I think this ties nicely into some of what we were describing before about vendors doing things, manufacturers and vendors doing things to educate the consumer.
Okay.
I think when we start talking about SLAs and that are applicable to other things, it kind of speaks to the vendor reaching out to the consumer as part of that product purchase and product consumption to better understand, what this actually means. Does that make
and
sense?
it doesn't have to be consumer, right, Paul? I mean, it could be also an enterprise. I mean, that's entering this SLA with their platform provider, for example.
Absolutely, yeah. And in that case, I just kind of use
Same
consumer
principles.
generically, yeah.
Okay. Yeah. Okay. Yeah, that's true. They're consuming. Okay.
Yeah,
So
definitely.
what you're saying then? I'm sorry, I interrupted you there, but you're saying so. Consider the SLA and
Definitely using it as a sort of a shopping point is a very good idea. Yes.
Now, what else is there to consider? I mean, the data at rest. I think that makes a lot of sense. The industry's matured in that area. The 5 nines that you talked about. All the ways to mitigate those type of attacks. Is there any other points to consider? I mean, other than the actual. Well, I mean, we've got confidentiality, we've got integrity, and we have what's the third one then? So confidentiality, that's more on the privacy side. Integrity is more of a network security side. And is there anything else we need to consider here?
So we've talked about availability.
Availability. That's right. Yeah, that's right.
I think when it comes to confidentiality and integrity in particular, those pieces of security, and we're looking at our data in transit between an IoT device of some type to some type of an enterprise hosted cloud service. That's our typical model for a lot of these products. And then in many cases, the data is first traversing some type of an RF type network before it hits that IP.
That's right. That's right.
So sorry, I just completely lost my train of thought.
No, but I guess what I'm thinking about is how do you quantify that data in motion? How do you quantify? Right. Because what we're talking about are all these interfaces between, the OT network, which is what's managing the sensors, and then the IT network, which is taking it to the backhaul, then the backhaul that's taken up to the cloud, then the cloud that's going to be going and you're going to be doing some analytics on it, but then eventually storing it somewhere. There's a lot of interfaces there. I can understand the data at rest and then moving that and kind of extrapolating that to have an SLA for availability anyway. But for confidentiality and integrity, that's a little bit harder to quantify, isn't it? I mean, I think that's what we're down to is I think the availability one we can quantify because we have vendors that are going to be ensuring this availability. But the security and the confidentiality, it seems a little bit, what am I missing here? I mean, how do you put this into this whole risk assessment equation, so to speak?
Right. So, I'll draw that line again back to overall awareness and understanding it. At this point, it's on the provider side as well as the consumer side. So, kind of another running joke in the security industry that you'll hear practitioners mentioned from time to time is, we have a firewall in front of it, and right. But it's encrypted, and assuming that's enough. So I think for the confidentiality and integrity pieces, it's always difficult and typically dangerous to try to give any guarantees around that. It's just it's not a possibility. But I do think that on the consumer side, whether it's an enterprise consumer or a Joe consumer with an IoT device, there are things that we can educate ourselves on to understand. And this, of course, it applies on the other side for the vendors that are producing these products. So taking the data encryption thing, what it really comes down to, while you can't really necessarily put an SLA on it, there are measurable pieces of that. So when we look at data encryption, particularly private key encryption, which is where most of your data at rest encryption is going to be coming from. The security of that encryption is really only as good as the secrecy of that key. And the secrecy of the key, of course, deals with the proper handling and transmission of that key. But also the likelihood of that key being randomly guessed, which is why you'll see as computational power increases, so does the size of our keys that are being used with these encryption algorithms. The reason for that is ultimately it comes down to a simple measurement of time that it would take to randomly crack, brute force, essentially, a key of a certain length. So it's
So you're
important.
saying you can quantify that then a little bit.
Exactly. And, you'll see some standards. In fact, something else that I'll mention that I'm surprised we don't see more of going out to consumers with these types of IoT products are hardening guides. Um, Hardening guides that both talk about encryption in a way that a consumer can understand. And I know that's easier said than done, but
Mm-hmm.
helping to understand that, the secrecy of your data here in terms of this encryption scheme, it's relying upon the secrecy of that key. And the key that's on your device right now is the same key that we put on every single device, which means it's
Right.
not secret right now. So you
Right.
should log into your device, click this button that says rotate
Change.
key or whatever. Hardening guidelines like that would be very important, but helping consumers to understand that, just like we might be able to see, trying to think of a really good example, but there are just certain things that consumers typically know about. Driver's license, passports, when you're checking into a hotel. These
Mhm.
days, when the hotel staff goes to make a photocopy of those types of things, most consumers are going to question that now.
Yeah.
We've adapted to that.
Don't like that. Yep.
My hope is that as we continue to utilize this technology that is so reliant upon data at rest, data in transit, that we begin to understand things in that same way. Just like we look at, hey, don't make a Xerox copy of my passport. I can look at it and say, wait a minute, you're using MD5 as your hashing algorithm? That's not good. That's a weak algorithm. We're not there yet. And, it speaks to some of the points we've made a few times today, the need for the consumer to be motivated to educate themselves on these types of things, as well as the product vendors to provide that motivation and maybe just take that first step forward in good faith of transparency and a way to just properly evaluate the risk to your security and privacy.
Yeah, no, I think that's true. But, on the other hand, I think there's also a risk that people are going to get into analysis paralysis. I mean, again, even the most complex models that are built by the Gartners of the world and the McKinseys of the world, they're all very, very simple at their core. They're just making all these assumptions. And we have a lot of knowns. Okay, we have a few unknowns, but we have a lot of knowns. So if, just to reiterate a little bit, specifically thinking about it from a business perspective, if we're doing our job right, and if you're listening to this show or anything else that I do, you are focused on value. If you're focused on value, you're going to know assets. If you know the assets, then you can come up with, even if you're just asking the questions, you come up with what are the attack surfaces. If you know what the attack surfaces are, and you know what the impact, you're going to know the impact, of this value. So then the likelihood, okay, that's the variable. Some of the likelihoods we can kind of quantify because, like you said, we'll have SLAs for maybe the transport of it. If we're lucky, definitely for the data at rest. If we're not, for sure. But then, we're going to know if we can ask the questions of simply where the attack surfaces, then okay, maybe it's between 0 and 1. We say, what is the possibility of hacking into the physical sensor? Give me a rough thing. And then you look at the different vendors, and then by talking to them, you probably get an idea. Same thing on the network platform. What is the possibility of, the OT IT connection, the backhaul connection, the cloud connection going through it? Again, it doesn't have to be rocket science, right? I mean, this is just a very simple model. And I think even just building something as simple as, and I'm still stuck on this, impact versus likelihood, we know most of the variables. So then, maybe we just have to ask a few questions, and a lot of it's going to be like a gut feel too. We talk to different vendors and we just see, what's their approach. Oh no, that guy's a 0, that guy's a 1, that guy, he seems a little, even if it's just that, right, Paul? I mean, then at least we have something. We have some model, and that's not that complicated to build. It's not going to take too much time.
That's precisely it. In fact, one of the many design principles that are out there related to secure design of really any system is referred to as economy of mechanism, and it's a simple way. It's a fancy way of saying keep it simple, stupid, is really what it's saying. And so
economy of mechanism. Okay,
economy of mechanism. So if we follow that design principle, the assumption is, just as you said, this architecture should be relatively easy to build, easy to understand, and all of it moves forward from there. There's one
Right.
piece that I didn't mention that is incredibly important to this entire process, both on
Mm.
the consumer side, more so the enterprise consumer, as well as
Okay.
on the product vendor side, and that is hire organizations like ISE to help guide you through the
Right.
security considerations, but also to validate what you've produced, and that's the most critical piece. Is and I don't want to go into the black box versus white box testing, but our typical
Mm.
assessment revolves around white box full disclosure, because that's your
Mm.
path of least resistance, if you will, to identifying your immediate security concerns.
And it's most efficient too, I imagine.
It really is, and there's a consistent methodology that can be applied there that's so important. We look at security, at least I think we're evolving from this, but we tend to look at the security industry, security practitioners as sort of cowboys, and of course everybody loves the idea of hackers,
Mm. Mm.
and it used to be the really sexy thing, but then we started to realize that when you hire a hacker that prefers to take that black box approach and just
Mm.
attack
Pen testing.
pen testing, essentially, it's subject to so many things: the skills of that hacker, the particular preferences or biases of tools or approaches.
Mm.
And
Mm.
you could probably hire 5 different pen testing firms, and maybe you'll get compromised by all of them, but probably 5 different ways.
Yeah.
Whereas a full
Right.
disclosure
Right.
white box approach, we
Yeah.
put it all out on the table, and it's also fantastic for identifying flaws at the design level that could otherwise cost a lot
Right.
of money later on when a pen tester identifies it.
Yeah. No, I like that. And you're right. I mean, you need the expertise here. If you're generating value, incremental value with your IoT products, so you're going to want to protect it. So you need to make an investment here. And if you don't have the internal folks that are capable, then security firms like yours would be the right way to go. And it's like the 80-20 rule. Even if you don't have a huge budget, if you're just using a little bit of money, that's going to get you a long way. And it's going to maybe it's all the showstoppers that you'll catch, or some of the things that you didn't think about. And I think that's a good recommendation. And what you're saying, even going beyond that, when talking to these security firms, your best practice is saying use a white box approach rather than a black box approach. Just full disclosure, it's going to be far more efficient, and it's going to be more predictable because, as you said, pen testing or penetration testing, there's so many variables there, and it's almost like sampling something you don't know what's there. Who knows where you're going to sample and all the stuff that you're going to miss. Is that a good way we can wrap things up? I mean, is that a good summary for your advice?
Yes. Yeah, that's exactly right.
Okay. Well, Paul, can you tell us? I really appreciate this, and I'm happy that we dug into the security by design and specifically and also the risk assessment. Can you tell our listeners tell us where can they find out more about you and your company?
Sure. So you could go to our website. It's www.securityevaluators.com.
Okay.
And we also have 2 really cool roadshow events that we feature at quite a few security conferences throughout the country. So the first is our So Hopelessly Broken roadshow, which is a look at small office, home office, network equipment, routers.
I love it.
Network attached storage, where we've just essentially demolished these devices from a security and hacking perspective.
Okay.
So we feature that at quite a few security conferences around the country. We'll be at, I think we've got B-Sides DC and TorCon coming up. We were just at DerbyCon this past week. Typically with So Hopelessly Broken, we feature a capture the flag contest for people to bring their own laptops.
Right. Love it. Yeah.
We also debuted the first IoT hacking village at DEF CON this summer.
Yes, I heard about that actually. Yeah, very cool.
So we expect to be taking that around as well. I think we'll have that in some form at B-Sides DC and TorCon. So and the websites for those, sohopelesslybroken.com and iotvillage.org. Have a lot of really cool information about the contests, results from the various conferences that we've been at, as well as upcoming conference appearances.
Yeah, and indirectly a lot of useful information too. All right, well we'll put all the above in the show analysis notes. So for listeners, you don't have to stop the car or try to ask someone for a pen or something like that while you're walking the dog. We'll put that in the show analysis notes. And with that, Paul, I'm going to thank you. Good luck on the road. So how many more stops you have to go on before you get home?
I've got LA and San Diego this week, and then I'm headed back to Maryland.
It's home sweet home. All right. Thanks, Paul.
Thanks so much, Bruce. Take care.
Okay, that was a good talk with Paul Dant. This podcast goes vertical, deep diving into different topics each week. If you prefer a more horizontal and structured approach to learning IoT business and its orbiting technologies, check out my book IoT Inc., published by McGraw-Hill, or become a certified IoT professional by completing the ICIP training and certification program. For details, just go to www.iot-inc.com. Also go to www.iot-inc.com for an analysis of this episode, links to things that were mentioned during the episode, and very importantly, the episode's PDF transcript. Just search for the name of the episode or the guest. If you're new to this podcast, subscribe. That way you'll get every week's episode delivered straight to your device. Or, if you've been listening for a while, there are 3 ways you can support the show. You can leave a rating or a review on iTunes. Just go to iot-inc.com/iTunes. It only takes 1 click to leave a rating, a little bit longer to leave a review. You can share it on social. I'm on LinkedIn, to a lesser extent on Twitter. And of course, you can support the show by buying my book, IoT Inc., or the ICIP training and certification program. It's how I pay the bills. Next week's episode is Tough and Tougher, IoT Security and Privacy with Justin Klein-Keene. I hope you can join me then. I'm your host, Bruce Sinclair. Thank you for listening. Till next week, may your path to IoT business be a less risky one.
You have been listening to the IoT Inc. Business Show.